The G7 meet in Japan. In a historic trip, U.S. President Barack Obama travels to Hiroshima and Vietnam, plus freedom of navigation and territorial claims in the South China Sea. Big stories, and we'll tackle them all. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. On most days, we go in-depth on a single story, but once a month, we like to take a step back from our usual format and spend a bit of time gathering fresh insight and analysis from those covering world events. To help us dive into these issues, we've put together a distinguished panel of journalists. Joining us is Wang Guan. He's the chief political correspondent for CCTV America's Mandarin service. Afshin Malawi is a non-resident fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the editor of the New Silk Road Monitor. Our own Nathan King is with us from our newsroom, and Simon Marks is the president and chief correspondent for Feature Story News. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Simon, President Obama has become the first sitting president to visit Hiroshima. Solemn event, very symbolic. He made a speech. He didn't apologize for the U.S. bombing of that city during World War II. But what does his presence there tell us?
Well, look, I mean, I think President Obama was walking a tightrope with this visit, and U.S. officials acknowledged as much even before he departed the United States. The president had been receiving competing advice about whether to go ahead and do this, even 2 or 3 weeks before the trip was actually going to get underway. In keeping with his desire to position himself as a president whose foreign policy legacy is trying to right some old wrongs, trying to advance conversations with countries like Iran, for example, or Cuba, with whom the United States has had historic enmities. President Obama wanted, I think, to be the president who became the first American president to set foot in this city where the United States, through its nuclear attack, killed so many people. But he also didn't want to play into Republican hands and engage in what the Republicans would have argued was an apology tour. So you had an event in Hiroshima in which the conversation was not one, if you like, about good guys and bad guys and rights and wrongs, but the conversation that he tried to frame was about the need to advance the case for nuclear disarmament. There will be those who say that because that's the tack he chose, there is still an historic issue that has to be settled, but there's no doubting the symbolism of this visit.
Right. Afshin, that case that Simon talks about for nuclear disarmament, the president made a speech at the wreath-laying ceremony in Hiroshima. Let's listen to part of what he said.
We may not be able to eliminate man's capacity to do evil. So nations and the alliances that we formed must possess the means to defend ourselves. But among those nations like my own that hold nuclear stockpiles, we must have the courage to escape the logic of fear and pursue a world without them.
So, very profound words there from the president, but how candid is he being? Because this is the president who signed off on a 30-year, $1 trillion nuclear modernization program.
Oh, exactly, and that's the issue here. You know, President Obama, as Simon noted, is at his best when he's, on these foreign trips, making grand gestures, delivering lofty words. He in and of himself represents something. He is a symbol of America's change, that an African-American president named Barack Hussein Obama could become president of the United States of America. When he goes around the world and he visits Hiroshima, this is an important symbolic act. It's good for the dignity of the office. It's good for the United States of America. Having said that, to your point, President Obama has done very little on reducing America's nuclear stockpile. He has this past history of delivering grand speeches and ultimately doing very little practically to deliver on those grand speeches. And I'm afraid here we have another instance in which that is the case.
Let's go to Nathan on this subject. And Nathan, 100,000 Japanese men, women and children were killed in that nuclear bomb attack on Hiroshima. Yeah. President Obama met some of the survivors, and some of those survivors expressed the hope that the president would announce some specifics on nuclear disarmament. But was that a realistic hope, or was this visit more about symbolism?
Oh, absolutely about symbolism. Remember, this was the sort of non-apology apology as well. Everything very much worked out in advance. And also, the US president can't cut nuclear weapons. We've already mentioned that the US is actually in the middle of a massive upgrade. China and the US are also looking at modernizing their nuclear weapons. They are also destabilizing actions, some would claim, from the US about forward basing of ballistic missile technology in Europe and Asia that actually increases the likelihood of more nuclear arms as well. So the words are there, but the actions are not. And of course, we haven't even brought into the DPRK expansion of its nuclear arsenal and the containment that is needed there. So even though 71 years on, the world is saying never again, when you actually look at the reality, the proliferation that we're seeing with, for example, the DPRK, and also the fact that the major nuclear powers are upgrading and modernizing their arsenal stands in stark contrast to that.
You want to say something?
And what's a greater example of that than the fact that he's making this speech about the need to embrace nuclear disarmament, and steps away from him, just outside the picture, is the man with the nuclear suitcase, the man with the nuclear codes. I mean, that tells you right there, there's the dichotomy.
Let's change tack and talk about the G7 summit. After President Obama left Hiroshima, he went to that seaside resort, met his 6 fellow leaders in the G7 there. They've been talking economic issues. China is, of course, the world's second biggest economy. It's not a member of the G7. How did China view this G7 summit?
Well, and then first of all, I want to chime in on the previous subject, if I can, on the intention of President Obama's trip to Hiroshima. And from the Chinese perspective, some of the intellectuals in China believe that this is an effort from the U.S. to, it's a marriage of America's intention to pivot to Asia, and Japan's intention to reinterpret the peaceful constitution to let the Japanese military play a more aggressive role. Given the constraints of U.S. resources and budget, it needs Japan to play a more active role. And under these circumstances, Obama's trip to Hiroshima is viewed in China to be one that is to reassure this alliance and boost this alliance and calm down the opposition to Abe. And with regard to G7, of course, China is not a member of the G7. Some feel that it has been, G7 is now really none of its business. China hopes to play a more constructive role through mechanisms such as C20 and other mechanisms. In fact, China is going full gears on preparing the G20 summit, which will be held in its eastern city of Hangzhou. But what we can see coming out of this Chinese Foreign Ministry statement is that it hopes G7 can really stick to its model of solving the world's economic problems, because out of the G7 we heard something about South China Sea, which the Chinese is not very happy about. They think that this is geopolitics instead of just solving economic issues.
Simon, the Japanese leader Shinzo Abe painted a very gloomy picture of the world economy at that G7 summit. He compared the situation now to the situation that existed in 2008 when we had the financial crisis. One of the big investment banks in New York shut down at that time. He's calling for a major fiscal stimulus, but we know that not everybody is buying that. Not everybody is on board as far as the world economy being gloomy is. And David Cameron, the United Kingdom Prime Minister, says no. Angela Merkel is having difficulty saying that it is gloomy. Why is Abe painting this gloomy picture?
Well, Abe's painting the gloomy picture because he's under pressure at home. He's got a sinking Japanese economy that he needs something to happen. He would love to see economic stimulus. He made it very clear before the G7 meeting began that this was the ask that he was going to bring to the table. Angela Merkel made it very clear that she was going to be declining. She believes there needs to be more structural reform, that there needs to be more discussion about debt. And remember that the European leaders are coming into this meeting waiting for the other shoe to drop, the other shoe being the outcome of the British referendum on whether it should remain part of the European Union or not. And the G7 leaders warned that if Brexit, as they call it, if Britain leaves, that's going to put further strain on the economies of Europe. So they're very cautious about meeting the demands that Shinzo Abe was making. One of the reasons, of course, why the G7 statement talked about all of these other issues is because they couldn't actually come together meaningfully and reach any accord on what to do about economic stimulus. And so I think that that partly explains why you saw this more scattergun approach in the G7 declaration.
Right, Nathan, those were the differences there, but what did this G7 summit accomplish?
Well, you know, you're never rude to your hosts, are you? And Japan has been hosting this, but very little is actually the real outcome here. I think you have a real different view on where the developed economies are going. Look, the US is got some growth, Europe is sluggish, but it's nowhere near what Japan is, especially when you take into account that Japan is something like 250% of GDP detonation. Where they did agree, of course, was on this statement on the South China Sea. And as Wang Guan eloquently said, the G7 is an economic club. What it's doing, talking about territorial claims in the South China Sea, of course, is another question. But Japan is the host. Japan, as you know, along with the US, have been pushing this, and they've got the rest of the world, G7 powers at least, to go along with it. But this is not actually necessarily helpful, especially as we go towards the G20, of course, which is going to be hosted in China.
Okay, let's get to President Obama's Vietnam visit. I'm doing his itinerary in reverse here. Afshin, pretty historic visit by the president to Vietnam. The two countries have been talking about a strategic partnership, becoming partners. There was the lifting of the UN arms embargo against Vietnam. How significant was this trip for the United States?
I think very significant. Again, back to the symbolism. I mean, Vietnam has such historic resonance in American history, in American modern history. 60,000 American soldiers roughly dead. And here is again a president who is in his element when he goes to a place like Vietnam, who is offering a different face of America. But this was also a natural progression in a relationship between two countries. After all, this is a relationship that has been growing. It's a dynamic trade relationship. It has gone from the early 1990s, zero, to about $45 billion trade relationship today. And let's not forget, on the eve of President Obama's visit to Vietnam, Vietjet, the national carrier, made a huge purchase of Boeing aircraft. So it's a natural progression of the visit. But the other thing is that as President Obama tries to pivot to Asia, so to speak, there has been a lot of talk of this Trans-Pacific Partnership, of which Vietnam is, one of the potential members of this Trans-Pacific Partnership if it ever gets ratified. Trouble is, it's not going to get ratified. So he goes to, Vietnam, and he goes on this Asia trip, and his signature policy policy measure is dying on the vine. And the U.S. Congress is not going to ratify it before November. And even after November, he's not going to be able to push it through a lame duck Congress. So symbolically, once again, an important visit. I think a natural progression on the U.S.-Vietnam relationship. But this important measurement is really dying on the vine as he travels across Asia.
Right. Nathan, Vietnam and its human rights record, it wasn't discussed, of course, but human rights experts here in the United States were saying that the United States was more interested in rearming Vietnam and lifting the arms embargo of an anti-China ally, as they put it, rather than talk about Vietnam's human rights record. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, there's been a lot of eyebrows raised among Asia watchers that when the US goes to China, it talks about human rights, but when it goes to Vietnam, it's carefully left off the table because you need other things. And there was a lot of that going on. Look, the US knows that strategically Vietnam is extremely important for it. It also knows that lifting the arms embargo, while Vietnam won't necessarily buy huge amounts of US weapons, it's definitely symbolic given the country's history. And, the US talked very, very more about trade, about the embargo, not necessarily about human rights. Although there was also other eyebrows raised. I'd like to raise this point, that when US President Barack Obama talked about big nations not bullying smaller nations, which was an apparent reference to China over Vietnam, a lot of Asia watchers were saying this is a bit of a tin-eared thing to say in Vietnam, given the US history in that country.
Simon, it seems like everything that's being done during these visits are well thought out strategic moves. The Eurasia Review tells us that, given China's One Belt, One Road initiative, that this visit was part of a geopolitical tactic, as the review tells us, to boost U.S. economic ties in Asia.
Well, I think that's definitely part of it. I mean, if you look at Vietnam, you saw President Obama embracing the opportunity to reach younger Vietnamese, because he senses that there's a generational shift coming there and there's an opportunity for the United States to establish a better relationship with the younger generation than obviously it had with the older generation, and for the United States therefore to gain economically as a result of that. But I think it's also about more than just that. He is the president who claims that the United States is a Pacific power, who has pivoted, as he puts it, American foreign policy towards the Asia-Pacific region, and yet everybody in that region sees what's going on back at home, sees the rise of Donald Trump, sees the contours of an American election campaign that is going to leave that foreign policy pivot very much in doubt. It is not the irrevocable foreign policy pivot that Barack Obama claims. And so I think he's got continuous confidence building to engage in the region to try and persuade people that after he departs the White House, any of this is going to continue.
Guan, President Obama's visit to Vietnam, how is China viewing the visit, especially the lifting of the arms embargo?
Well, officially, China's foreign ministry said it welcomes the arms embargo. It said the lifting is long overdue, but they added that all arms embargoes should be lifted. You know, what I interpret that to mean is that there has been this arms embargo on China for 20 years, ever since the 1989 incident. And China would very much hope the US, as well as the EU, can lift this arms embargo, because think about it, the United States, 30% of global arms trade comes from the United States. Had the United States lifted the arms embargo, it could have largely shrink the trade deficit with China, which now stands at a staggering $500 billion. That is something China has been asking the United States to do. So by and large, China, you know, officially it welcomes the rapprochement between Vietnam and the US, but I think quietly, I wouldn't be surprised if they think that this is a geopolitical maneuver against China. You know, there has been this China-Vietnam dispute, China-Philippines dispute, and if you look at the forward deployment surrounding China from the US, a forward deployment military against China, you know, it's just a counterbalance to China's rise.
Afshin, that pivot to Asia could come to a standstill, as Simon has pointed out, after the election, but how does a country like Vietnam fit into that?
Well, I think a country like Vietnam fits broadly into, you know, this idea that President Obama has had, that you know, you have a world in which 60% of the world's population lives in Asia, right? Vietnam, large country, growing, dynamic. I can tell you, as someone who goes to a lot of institutional investor conferences, that Vietnam is the country on many people's lips as the next dynamic, growing economy in Asia, right? And so it fits well into it if it's an economic story. What troubles me, however, with the pivot to Asia, it seems like it's 80% security, 20% commercial. I'd like to see that more balanced out, because I think when you talk about the pivot to Asia and you talk to American corporates about the pivot to Asia, they say, you know, we've been pivoting to Asia for 25 years, you know. Well, you know, thank you, you know, President Obama, for finally realizing the opportunities, you know, in Asia. And so I think ultimately, if this pivot to Asia is going to work, and if it's going to really benefit America's prosperity and national security, we have to raise the commercial aspect of the pivot to Asia, and in many ways decelerate, you know, the heavy talk on the security aspect.
Yeah, right, because it's sometimes called rebalancing, which is basically putting more warships in the Pacific, right?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, we are going to have to take a break right now. When we come back, freedom of navigation and territorial claims in the South China Sea. Plus, what's the next big story? We'll ask our panel. Stay with us, you're watching The Heat. Welcome back to our Journalist Roundtable. Let's get right back to it. And Guan, let's move to the South China Sea. The United States Navy has been carrying out what they term freedom of navigation operations near Chinese islands. How have Chinese authorities responded to this?
Well, in fact, you know, Chinese authorities have, of course, repeatedly rejecting such moves, calling that provocative. And also, if you think about it, China really doesn't mind freedom of navigation, or whatever you call it, because Chinese navies patrolled the Alaska area when Obama was there last year, and the U.S. did not protest. What China was saying was that it should be conducted in good faith, right? Even the UN Convention on Law of the Sea says countries can conduct freedom of navigation exercises, but they cannot militarily threaten another country or conduct it not in a good faith. So that's China's concern. Basically, I think this issue is more geopolitics than international law, because you can get lawyers, both sides can get best lawyers in town and delegitimize each other's claims. But what really happened is, I think, it's geopolitics. The U.S. went from tacit recognition of China's claims in South China Sea, when China was a World War II ally along with the UK and the Soviet Union, to where the U.S. geopolitical doctrine shifted to anti-communism, to tacit denial of China's claims, and therefore the freedom of navigation exercises.
Right. Nathan, and Guan just alluded to this a moment ago, the Chinese saying that these actions by the US Navy is a provocation. Is this Washington flexing its muscle?
Whenever you see a warship go 12 miles towards someone's territory, of course, it can be seen aggressive. Someone this week described to me the freedom of navigation operations as a solution looking for a problem. There has not been any problem of navigation in the South China Sea. The worry is, from the American side, is that they could be because of increased Chinese presence there. But so far, it hasn't happened. And then you've got to think about it. What is the end game here from these freedom of navigation operations? Is there a military solution down the road? Everyone thinks, of course, there isn't. So if you're using military to make a point, how far does it go? And think about this from US allies in the region, and we're thinking about the Philippines here. We have a new president being elected. And even the most hawkish Philippines politicians do not believe that the US would go to war over any islands in the South China Sea backing their allies. So the big question is, how far is Washington willing to go, and will it destabilize the relationship with China and the US? And China, of course, has protested about these sailings of 12 miles near islands, of course, in the Shisha and Nanja Islands, as China calls them. But the biggest problem for China has been the lack of due regard, as the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea has said, about US ships and aircraft actually buzzing Chinese submarines and shipping off the Chinese mainland coast and Hainan Island. They don't think that's legal under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and they see more of the same potentially happening in the South China Sea.
And actually, that claim or complaint by the Philippines has led to quite an interesting and somewhat complex legal case. There is this international tribunal which is sitting in The Hague, which is convened to listen to this case. A decision is expected very soon, in the next few weeks. What impact will any decision have on this?
It will have no impact on these kind of disputes are always solved, bilaterally or in some sort of multilateral format. But when you have a Hague arbitration, it's not going to suddenly, and if it favors the Philippines, for example, I don't think we're going to see Beijing suddenly say, okay,
well, actually,
fine.
Beijing doesn't recognize the jurisdiction of
Precisely, yeah. So it will have no impact. It will have no material impact on the ground, or shall we say on the sea.
Simon, why has this become such a big hot-button issue?
Because no one's speaking plainly to each other about what's happening, or certainly they're not doing that in public. Nathan is quite right. One of the questions here is, how far is the United States prepared to go? Well, there are clearly limits to how far the United States is going to go in the remaining months of the Obama presidency, and limits also in the president's seeming willingness to say directly what he means. The United States says, we're not a claimant, this is purely an issue of freedom of navigation and overflight rights, but clearly from the United States perspective, this is a problem because the Obama administration believes that China is trying to expand its territory, but it doesn't say that publicly. And equally, from the Chinese side, there's limits to the way in which these activities are described, and it is going to take, as Afshin said, a multilateral, a series of bilateral or multilateral open discussions to resolve these issues, and those conversations aren't timetabled.
Guan, is arbitration, do you think, going to lead anywhere? Because China's foreign ministry says the country's activities in the South China Sea are legitimate, justifiable. In fact, Beijing blames Japan for what it called exaggerating tensions in the region.
Well, I agree with what my colleagues have said. Usually this kind of territorial national security issues, those hardcore issues, are left to bilateral negotiations, not left to third-party arbitration. So according to Article 298 of the UNCLOS, China, along with some 40 Western countries, Denmark, Canada, Australia as well, they ruled out, they have a reservation, meaning they decided that will not accept third-party arbitration on sovereignty.
Right,
So,
UNCLOS, that's the strange-sounding acronym for the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. Afshin, Nathan talked earlier on about what is the end game here. I mean, we have this treaty, which is there. Would it be easier for both sides if everybody signed on to this? The U.S. is not a signatory to that treaty.
It certainly would. I mean, the U.S., you're right, is not a signatory to that treaty, and certainly it would lend a little bit of moral authority, to the U.S. position if they had signed on to that treaty. But then again, once again, there's long history of people ignoring UN treaties. When it comes to, as Guan said, these kind of big, territorial, geopolitical issues, you're going to have bilateral, multilateral negotiations. Signing that treaty is the right thing to do. And oddly enough, the past 3 U.S. presidents have advocated for it. It's just sticking in the U.S. Congress, and they're not signing it. Obviously, they haven't advocated strongly enough for it, though. Okay, finally, let's get to the next big story. Nathan, you first.
I'm going to disagree with the panel. I think actually the Permanent Court of Arbitration over the UN Convention Law of the Sea ruling is actually going to be important for several reasons. Look, it's not going to be binding. China is not going to abide by it. But what it actually might do is actually question historical rights when it comes to sovereign claims in not just the South China Sea, but across the world. And this could be potentially dangerous for any wide-ranging international agreements when it comes to sovereignty. Remember, as Wang Guan said, there are exceptions to sovereignty in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. China detailed it in 2006 and, of course, before. But if that is called into question, it weakens the treaty, and it also weakens international monitoring this as well. So it could actually lead to a scramble of claims, potentially a scramble of building as well, and also perhaps more legal claims by other claimants as well. So it could end up being quite a mess.
Afshin, what's the next big story?
The next big story, we are entering, the Muslim world is entering Ramadan this next month. So for 1 month, 1.2 billion Muslims will celebrate Ramadan peacefully. They will reflect, they will fast, but Islamist extremists will not be peaceful. If past history is any guide, we will see ISIS step up its attacks. There will be Ramadan offensives. After the most recent killing of the Taliban leader, we are likely to see Taliban potentially stepping up its attacks as well. So while 1.2 billion Muslims will mostly celebrate Ramadan peacefully, expect ISIS to light up the theater as well as the Taliban.
Simon?
The next big story is a story that will render our entire conversation today null and void. U.S. public health... It's a downer. U.S. public health officials warned this week that the world is reaching the end of the road for antibiotics. The first case of an infection that resists the antibiotic of last resort has been detected in the United States. And this is a very, very serious public health issue. If you can't use, if drug-resistant antibiotics get to the point where no antibiotic is powerful enough to beat the infection, we're all in serious, serious trouble.
Well, that's a cheerful thought on the eve of this Memorial Day weekend. But let's go to Guan. What's the next big story?
Every year or every other year, Chinese leadership, top leadership, take this summer retreat to China's Camp David, called Beidaihe. There they make important economic decisions, political decisions, and more importantly, personnel decisions. So next year is China's 19th Party Congress, the Communist Party of China, the ruling party. So what will come out of this summer retreat? Who will be governing? Who will be sitting on the permanent seats of the Politburo of the Standing Committee of CPC, which decides how China will be run, is that fascinating.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.